The summer of 1832 in Loudoun County, Virginia arrived with a particular type of humidity that clung to the skin like a desperate hand. Eliza Montgomery stood on the wraparound porch of Willow Creek Plantation, her eyes fixed on the fields stretching beyond the carefully manicured gardens. The cotton plants swayed gently in the evening breeze, their white bowls catching the last golden rays of sunlight. Beautiful, she thought, but beauty built on blood. At 32, Eliza was unusual among the plantation mistresses of Virginia. Widowed at 28 when her husband James died from typhoid fever, she had managed the plantation alone for 4 years now, defying the expectations of neighboring landowners who assumed she would remarry or sell the property. Willow Creek prospered under her management, producing some of the finest cotton and tobacco in the region. "Miss Eliza," called a voice from behind her. "The packages from Richmond have arrived." Eliza turned to face Sarah, a house slave who had been with the Montgomery family since before Eliza's marriage. At 53, Sarah's dark skin bore the lines of decades of service, but her eyes remained alert and observant. "Thank you, Sarah. Have them brought to the study, please." Sarah nodded, her expression carefully neutral. "Yes, ma'am." "And Jeremiah is waiting to speak with you about tomorrow's shipment." Eliza felt a tightening in her chest at the mention of Jeremiah. The overseer had been increasingly difficult lately, questioning her decisions and making thinly veiled suggestions that a woman couldn't possibly understand the complexities of running a plantation. "I'll see him shortly," Eliza replied, turning back to gaze at the fields one last time before following Sarah inside. The interior of Willow Creek Mansion was cool compared to the oppressive heat outside. Crystal chandeliers hung from high ceilings, and expensive carpets from Europe covered polished hardwood floors. Everything spoke of wealth and refinement, wealth accumulated through generations of forced labor. In her study, Eliza found several packages neatly arranged on her desk. One small wooden box caught her attention immediately. She opened it carefully, revealing a dozen small glass vials containing a dark liquid. A folded piece of paper lay beneath them. "The West Indian remedy you inquired about," the note read in elegant script. "Use with extreme caution. 3 drops in wine will induce a state of compliance without visible symptoms. More may cause undesirable effects. Destroy this note." Eliza stared at the vials, a mixture of emotions washing over her. She had heard whispers about this concoction from a French plantation owner's wife at a dinner party months ago. A way to make the slaves more docile, more compliant, without the brutality of the whip. A more humane approach, the woman had suggested with a conspiratorial smile. Eliza slipped the box into a drawer and locked it just as a knock sounded at the door. "Enter," she called, composing her features. Jeremiah stood in the doorway, his tall frame filling the space. At 45, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed in his own authority. His reddish-brown hair was streaked with grey, and his skin bore the leathery texture of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. "Mrs. Montgomery," he began, his voice carrying a hint of impatience. "We need to discuss the cotton shipment. The buyers in Philadelphia are demanding we deliver early, and I don't believe we have enough hands to meet their timeline." "I'm aware of the situation, Mr. Reynolds," Eliza replied coolly. "I've already made arrangements to hire additional labor from the Thornton plantation for the next 2 weeks." Jeremiah frowned. "Without consulting me? Mrs. Montgomery, with all due respect, these decisions are mine to make, Mr. Reynolds," Eliza interrupted, her voice firm despite the rapid beating of her heart. "Willow Creek is my property, and I expect my overseer to carry out my instructions, not question them." A flash of anger crossed Jeremiah's face before he schooled his features into a mask of professional detachment. "As you wish. But I must insist that we discuss the issue of the troublemakers in the East Field. Isaiah and Marcus have been filling the others' heads with dangerous ideas. I caught them reading yesterday. The mention of Isaiah sent an uncomfortable sensation through Eliza's body. At 26, Isaiah was one of the strongest and most intelligent slaves on the plantation. Born at Willow Creek, he had been educated in secret by Eliza's late husband, who had unconventional ideas about the capabilities of enslaved people. Isaiah could read and write better than most white men in the county, a dangerous skill for a slave to possess. "What were they reading?" Eliza asked, trying to keep her voice neutral. "Some abolitionist pamphlet. God knows where they got it. I've had them both whipped and confined to the quarters, but Isaiah continues to be defiant." Eliza nodded slowly. "I'll speak with Isaiah myself tomorrow. In the meantime, ensure that the extra hands from Thornton arrive by noon. That will be all, Mr. Reynolds." Jeremiah hesitated, clearly wanting to say more, but eventually gave a curt nod and left the study. Alone again, Eliza unlocked the drawer and stared at the box of vials. The thought that had been forming in her mind for weeks now crystallized into a decision. She would try the remedy, just once, just to see if it offered a more humane alternative to the whip, perhaps with Isaiah, whose intelligence made him dangerous, but also potentially valuable if properly managed. That night, Eliza found sleep elusive. The plantation house creaked and sighed around her, and from her bedroom window she could see the distant lights of lanterns in the slave quarters. What dreams and nightmares filled those cramped cabins? What whispers of freedom, of rebellion, of justice passed from one exhausted body to another? Morning arrived with a chorus of birdsong and the rhythmic sound of the bell calling the slaves to the fields. Eliza dressed carefully, selecting a dark green day dress that emphasized her position of authority while remaining practical for plantation management. After a solitary breakfast, she summoned Sarah. "Have Isaiah brought to the library in 1 hour," she instructed, "and bring a bottle of the sweet red wine from the cellar, with 2 glasses. Sarah's expression remained impassive, but something flickered in her eyes, concern perhaps, or suspicion. "Yes, Miss Eliza. Anything else?" "That will be all for now." When Sarah had gone, Eliza retrieved one of the vials from her study and tucked it into her pocket. Her hand trembled slightly, and she told herself it was merely nerves about trying something new, not doubt about the morality of her actions. The library at Willow Creek was James Montgomery's pride. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves held volumes on every subject imaginable, from agriculture and law to poetry and philosophy. A portrait of James hung above the marble fireplace, his intelligent eyes seeming to follow Eliza as she moved around the room, preparing for her meeting with Isaiah. When the door opened, Eliza was seated at the large oak table in the center of the room, a ledger open before her as though she had been reviewing accounts. Isaiah entered, flanked by 2 white overseers who roughly pushed him forward. "Leave us," Eliza commanded, and the overseers exchanged a concerned glance. "Ma'am, are you sure that's wise? This one's been causing trouble." "I said leave us," Eliza repeated firmly. "Wait outside the door. I'll call if I need assistance." Reluctantly, the men withdrew, closing the door behind them, but undoubtedly remaining alert just outside. Isaiah stood before her, his posture straight, despite the visible welts on his exposed forearms, evidence of yesterday's punishment. His dark skin was marked with older scars as well, a map of suffering etched into his flesh. His eyes, however, held no hint of subservience. They met hers directly, challenging, intelligent. "You asked to see me, Mrs. Montgomery," he stated, not a question but an acknowledgement. "Yes, Isaiah, please, sit down." Eliza gestured to the chair across from her. Surprise flickered across his face. Slaves were rarely invited to sit in the presence of their owners, but he complied cautiously. "Mr. Reynolds tells me you were caught reading abolitionist literature," Eliza began, studying his face. "You know that's forbidden." "Yes, ma'am." "Where did you get the pamphlet?" Isaiah remained silent, his jaw tightening. Eliza sighed. "Isaiah, I've known you since you were a boy. My husband saw potential in you, educated you against all convention. I've continued to allow you certain privileges that other slaves don't enjoy. but I can't protect you if you insist on causing trouble. Is that what seeking knowledge is called on Willow Creek? Trouble? The words came out before Isaiah could stop them, his voice low but intense. Instead of anger, Eliza felt a strange admiration for his courage. Knowledge can be dangerous, Isaiah, particularly when it gives people ideas above their station. As if on cue, Sarah entered with a tray holding a bottle of wine and 2 crystal glasses. She set it down on the table, her eyes briefly meeting Isaiah's before she silently withdrew. Eliza poured 2 glasses of the deep red wine, her back to Isaiah, as she carefully added 3 drops from the vial to one of them. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain he must hear it. My husband believed that occasional rewards were more effective than constant punishment, she said, turning back to face him. Despite your recent behavior, you've been a valuable worker at Willow Creek. I'm willing to overlook this incident if you can assure me there won't be further problems. She pushed the doctored glass toward him. Isaiah looked at it suspiciously. You want me to drink with you? Consider it a gesture of good faith, Eliza replied, raising her own glass. To a new understanding between us. Isaiah hesitated, clearly weighing his options. Refusal would be seen as further defiance, potentially resulting in more severe punishment. Slowly, he reached for the glass. To understanding, he murmured, his eyes never leaving hers as he took a sip. Eliza watched carefully as he drank, searching for any immediate reaction. The Frenchwoman had said the effects would take approximately 15 minutes to manifest. Tell me, Isaiah, she said conversationally, what did the pamphlet say that interested you so much? For a moment, he seemed determined to maintain his silence, but then something shifted in his expression. It spoke of the natural rights of all men to freedom. It said that slavery is not just a social evil, but a sin against God. Do you believe that? Don't you, Mrs. Montgomery? He countered, his voice softer now but no less intense. You attend church every Sunday. You hear the preachers speak of God's love for all his children. How do you reconcile that with owning people? Eliza felt a chill despite the warm June air. This was precisely the kind of dangerous thinking Jeremiah had warned about. Yet something compelled her to answer honestly. The Bible speaks of masters and servants. The economy of the South depends on slave labor. Without it, plantations like Willow Creek couldn't exist. And that justifies it, Isaiah asked, taking another sip of wine. His eyes seemed slightly unfocused now, his posture more relaxed. The suffering of thousands for the comfort of a few. The directness of his question should have angered her. Instead, Eliza felt a disconcerting sense that she was being judged not by a slave, but by her own conscience wearing Isaiah's face. The world is more complicated than abolitionists would have you believe, she replied, watching as he drained his glass. Change must come gradually, with proper planning. Immediate emancipation would lead to chaos. Isaiah's eyelids drooped slightly and he blinked as though trying to clear his vision. The pamphlet said that's just an excuse, that the real reason is... His words began to slur and alarm flashed through Eliza. Was this normal? The Frenchwoman hadn't mentioned slurred speech among the effects. Isaiah, are you feeling unwell? He tried to focus on her face. Something's wrong. What's in the wine? Panic seized Eliza as Isaiah's hand knocked against the glass, sending it rolling across the table. He attempted to stand but stumbled, collapsing back into the chair. Help! Eliza called, rushing to the door. Come quickly! The overseers burst into the room, taking in the scene with suspicious eyes. He's ill, Eliza explained hastily. Take him to the infirmary immediately. Fetch Dr. Winters from town. As they dragged the barely conscious Isaiah away, Eliza remained in the library, her hands shaking uncontrollably. What had she done? Had she used too much of the remedy, or was Isaiah having an unexpected reaction to it? By evening, word spread through Willow Creek like wildfire. Isaiah had fallen into a deep sleep from which he could not be roused. Dr. Winters, a portly man with bushy sideburns who attended to both the Montgomery family and their valuable property, was baffled by the slave's condition. "It resembles neither apoplexy nor any fever I'm familiar with," he told Eliza as they stood by Isaiah's bedside in the small plantation infirmary. "His heart rate is steady, his breathing regular. It's as though he's merely in a very deep sleep." "Will he recover?" Eliza asked, trying to keep the tremor from her voice. Dr. Winters shrugged. "Impossible to say without knowing the cause. Has he eaten or drunk anything unusual?" Eliza felt the weight of the doctor's gaze. "Only the same food and drink as everyone else," she lied smoothly. "Perhaps he was already ill and hiding it. Some of them do that to avoid work." "Perhaps," the doctor agreed, though he didn't sound convinced. "I'll return tomorrow. Send for me immediately if his condition changes." That night, Eliza sat alone in her bedroom, a single candle casting shifting shadows across the walls. The box of vials sat open before her, a silent accusation. What had possessed her to try such a thing? Was it fear of losing control of her plantation, resentment at being constantly questioned by men like Jeremiah, or something deeper, a desire to assert power over someone who, despite his legal status as property, made her feel somehow inadequate with his intelligence and dignity? Outside her window, she could hear unusual activity in the slave quarters, hushed voices, movement after curfew. News of Isaiah's mysterious illness had spread, and with it, undoubtedly, suspicion. Eliza closed the box and hid it in a secret compartment behind a loose brick in her fireplace. She would dispose of the vials tomorrow, forget this moment of madness. But as she drifted into uneasy sleep, Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted at Willow Creek, something that could never be undone. Dawn broke over Willow Creek with an eerie silence. No birds sang in the ancient oak trees surrounding the plantation house, and the usual sounds of early morning activity from the slave quarters were noticeably absent. Eliza stood at her bedroom window, watching as the first rays of sunlight illuminated the mist hovering over the fields. Something was wrong. The plantation bell rang, calling the slaves to their daily labor. But from her vantage point, Eliza could see no movement in the quarters. She dressed hurriedly, a sense of foreboding building in her chest. When she reached the dining room, she found Sarah setting out breakfast as usual, though the woman's movements seemed mechanical, her expression closed. "Sarah, what's happening? Why isn't anyone responding to the bell?" Sarah paused, her hands gripping the edge of a silver serving tray. "They're afraid, Miss Eliza." "Afraid? Of what?" "They're saying Isaiah was poisoned." Sarah's eyes finally met Eliza's, and the accusation in them was unmistakable. "They're saying it's a warning to anyone who gets ideas about freedom." Eliza felt the blood drain from her face. "That's absurd. Isaiah fell ill. Dr. Winters is attending to him." "Dr. Winters treats symptoms, not causes," Sarah replied, her usual deference giving way to a subtle defiance. "And the people know what they know." Before Eliza could respond, the dining room door burst open, and Jeremiah strode in, his face flushed with anger. "Mrs. Montgomery, we have a situation. Not a single slave has reported for work this morning. They're staging some kind of protest over that troublemaker Isaiah." Eliza straightened her spine, forcing a calm she didn't feel into her voice. "Have you spoken to them?" "Spoken?" Jeremiah scoffed. "I've threatened them with whippings all around, but they're barricaded in the quarters, even sent the children into the woods to hide. We need to make an example, show them who's in charge, before this gets completely out of hand." "Violence won't solve this, Mr. Reynolds," Eliza said firmly. "If they believe Isaiah was poisoned, using the whip will only confirm their fears that the plantation management is resorting to more extreme measures of control." "Then what do you suggest?" Jeremiah demanded, barely concealing his contempt for her leadership. Eliza thought quickly. "I'll speak to them myself. They need reassurance that Isaiah's illness is natural, nothing more." "You can't seriously be considering negotiating with slaves," Jeremiah protested. "Not negotiating, clarifying." Eliza turned to Sarah, who had been silently observing the exchange. "Sarah, please inform the quarter residents that I will address them in 1 hour outside the main cabin. They have my word that no punishments will be administered if they hear me out." Sarah nodded, her expression unreadable as she left the dining room. "This is a mistake," Jeremiah warned when they were alone. "Show weakness now, and you'll never regain control." "I'm not showing weakness, Mr. Reynolds. I'm demonstrating leadership." Eliza met his gaze steadily. "And I expect your full support in this matter." Jeremiah's jaw clenched, but he gave a curt nod before leaving the room. Alone, Eliza sank into a chair, her composure finally cracking. How had everything unraveled so quickly? Just yesterday, Willow Creek had operated as it had for generations, a well-oiled machine of production and profit. Now, rebellion simmered just beneath the surface, and at the center of it all was the secret she carried, the vial of West Indian remedy, and her role in Isaiah's condition. For a moment, she considered confessing everything, explaining that she had only meant to try a more humane method of control, not to cause harm. But she knew such an admission would destroy her authority permanently, and might even lead to criminal charges if word spread beyond the plantation. No, she would have to find another way through this crisis. An hour later, Eliza stood before the assembled residents of the slave quarters, nearly 80 men, women, and children who represented the backbone of Willow Creek's prosperity. They maintained a respectful distance, their faces solemn and watchful. Several of the men, friends of Isaiah, stood at the front, their postures tense and protective. "I understand you're concerned about Isaiah," Eliza began, projecting her voice to reach even those at the back of the gathering. "I want to assure you that he's receiving the best medical care possible. Dr. Winters believes he's suffering from a sudden illness, perhaps a brain fever, and is doing everything he can to help him recover." Marcus, Isaiah's closest friend and fellow troublemaker, according to Jeremiah, stepped forward. In his early 30s, with powerful shoulders from years of fieldwork, he commanded respect among the other slaves. "With all due respect, Mrs. Montgomery, Isaiah was in perfect health until he was called to the big house. Now he won't wake up. Some folks saw him drinking wine with you, wine that only he drank." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, and Eliza felt perspiration beading on her forehead, despite the relatively cool morning air. "It's true that Isaiah and I shared a drink while discussing his recent activities," she acknowledged, choosing her words carefully. "But we drank from the same bottle. If the wine was tainted in some way, I would be ill as well." "Unless you knew which glass to avoid," called a voice from the crowd. Eliza's heart raced, but she maintained her composure. "These accusations are both false and dangerous. I called you here not to defend myself against unfounded suspicions, but to address the work stoppage. Willow Creek has always been known for its fair treatment of its workers compared to other plantations in the region. Your food is adequate, your quarters maintained, punishments administered only when necessary. In return, I expect loyalty and diligence." "Loyalty?" Marcus questioned, his voice low but carrying clearly. "Isaiah showed loyalty to Willow Creek his entire life. He was born here, worked harder than any 2 men combined. His only crime was learning to read, a skill your own husband taught him, and using that skill to read forbidden materials, to spread dangerous ideas," Jeremiah interjected, stepping forward to stand beside Eliza. His hand rested meaningfully on the whip coiled at his belt. "The kind of ideas that make men like you nervous, Mr. Reynolds," Marcus challenged, a dangerous glint in his eye. The tension in the air was palpable. Eliza realized she was standing on a precipice. One wrong word could send the situation spiraling into violence. "Enough," she said firmly. "Isaiah's condition is unfortunate but natural. I give you my word that he will continue to receive medical care, and I will personally monitor his progress. In the meantime, work must resume. Return to your duties now, and there will be no repercussions for this morning's delay." persist in this defiance, and I cannot guarantee such leniency." The crowd remained motionless, faces turned toward Marcus, waiting for his response. After a long moment, he nodded slowly. "We'll return to work, but we want to see Isaiah, make sure he's being treated proper. 2 representatives may visit the infirmary this evening after the day's work is complete," Eliza conceded, sensing that this small victory for the slaves was necessary to avoid a larger confrontation. Marcus nodded again, and gradually the crowd began to disperse, moving reluctantly toward the fields and other work areas. As Eliza turned to walk back to the main house, she noticed Sarah standing slightly apart, watching the proceedings with an inscrutable expression. Their eyes met briefly, and Eliza was struck by the realization that despite having known Sarah her entire life, she had no idea what the woman truly thought or felt. Like all the enslaved people at Willow Creek, Sarah presented only what she needed to survive. Back in the main house, Eliza retreated to her study, instructing that she not be disturbed. She needed time to think, to plan her next steps carefully. The situation had been temporarily diffused, but she harbored no illusions that the underlying tensions had been resolved. She unlocked a cabinet and withdrew a leather-bound journal, her private diary kept secured from prying eyes. Opening to a fresh page, she began to write, the scratch of her pen against paper the only sound in the quiet room. June 15th, 1832. I find myself in a predicament of my own making, a tangled web from which I can see no clean escape. Isaiah lies unconscious. The plantation teeters on the edge of open rebellion, and I alone know the truth that binds these circumstances together. The remedy was meant to be a more humane alternative, a way to maintain order without brutality. Instead, it may prove to be the instrument of my undoing. What troubles me most is not fear of discovery, but the realization that I cannot discern my own motivations clearly. Did I truly believe I was seeking a gentler method of control? Or was I, like so many before me, merely finding a more palatable justification for exerting my will over another human being? James would be ashamed. For all his conventional beliefs about the necessity of the peculiar institution for Southern prosperity, he never took pleasure in the power it conferred. He treated our people with a distant benevolence that, while paternalistic, at least acknowledged their humanity. What would he say if he could see me now, poisoning a man for the crime of desiring freedom? Eliza paused, her pen hovering over the page as she considered whether to commit her darkest thoughts to paper. After a moment's hesitation, she continued, "The truth that dare not speak its name, even in these private pages, is that part of me has always feared Isaiah, not for his physical strength, though he possesses that in abundance, but for the power of his mind and spirit. When he looks at me, I feel seen in a way that is both intimate and terrifying, as though he perceives not just Mrs. Montgomery, plantation mistress, but Eliza, the woman with all her doubts and contradictions. Perhaps that is the most insidious aspect of slavery, not just that it corrupts the souls of those who practice it, but that it forces us to deny the full humanity of others, lest we be forced to confront our own moral failings." A knock at the door startled Eliza, causing her to blot the ink. Quickly closing the journal and returning it to its hiding place, she called, "Enter!" Dr. Winters stepped into the study, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. His expression was grave. "Mrs. Montgomery, I've just come from examining Isaiah again. I'm afraid his condition has deteriorated." Eliza felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. Deteriorated how? His breathing has become irregular, and he's developed a fever. Without knowing the cause of his ailment, I'm limited in what treatments I can offer. The doctor hesitated, then added, "There are whispers among your people that he was poisoned. I dismiss such talk as superstition, but I must ask, is there any possibility he could have ingested something harmful?" Eliza's mind raced. If Isaiah died, the tenuous peace she had negotiated this morning would shatter. The slaves would be convinced their suspicions were correct, and no amount of reassurance would persuade them otherwise. Yet confession now seemed equally disastrous. "Isaiah had access to the library yesterday," she said carefully. "Perhaps he came into contact with something there, dust from old books, or some chemical used to preserve the bindings. Would such a thing cause these symptoms?" Dr. Winters looked skeptical. "It's possible, I suppose, though unlikely to cause such a profound reaction. Has anyone else who entered the library shown signs of illness?" "No, no one." Eliza rose from her desk and moved to the window, needing to escape the doctor's penetrating gaze. "What can be done for him?" "I've administered a tonic to reduce the fever, and will continue to monitor him closely. If you could permit one of the slave women who has nursing experience to sit with him through the night, that would be helpful. I have other patients to attend to, and cannot remain at Willow Creek indefinitely." "Of course, I'll arrange it immediately." Eliza turned back to face him. "And Doctor, thank you for your discretion in this matter. The situation is delicate enough without further inflaming tensions." "Doctor." Winters nodded, though something in his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by her explanation. "As your family's physician for many years, I respect your privacy, Mrs. Montgomery. But as a medical practitioner, my primary concern is my patient's well-being. If there's anything else you can tell me that might help Isaiah, I urge you to do so." At the moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken suspicions and withheld truths, finally Eliza shook her head. "There's nothing more I can add. Please keep me informed of any changes in his condition." After the doctor left, Eliza remained by the window, watching as dark clouds gathered on the horizon, promising an afternoon thunderstorm. The weather matched her mood, ominous, unsettled, with worse to come. She thought of the vials hidden in her fireplace. She should destroy them immediately, eliminate the evidence of her terrible error. Yet something held her back. Perhaps the faint hope that understanding the remedy better might help in treating Isaiah, or perhaps just the cowardly instinct for self-preservation. The rest of the day passed in a state of superficial normalcy that did little to mask the underlying tensions. The slaves returned to work as promised, but there was none of the usual chatter in the fields. No songs to ease the burden of labor under the hot Virginia sun. Jeremiah and the other overseers maintained closer watch than usual, hands never straying far from their whips. By evening, the storm had broken over Willow Creek, rain lashing against the windows of the plantation house as thunder rolled across the sky. Eliza sat in the formal dining room, picking at her solitary dinner, while lightning periodically illuminated the room in stark white flashes. Sarah entered with a fresh pot of tea, setting it down carefully beside Eliza's barely touched plate. "Will there be anything else, Miss Eliza? Has Marcus chosen who will visit Isaiah this evening?" "Himself and old Rebecca," Sarah replied. "They're waiting for your permission to enter the infirmary." Rebecca was one of the oldest slaves at Willow Creek, a woman in her 70s who served as midwife and healer in the quarters. If anyone would recognize signs of poisoning, it would be her. "They may see him, but tell them to be brief. Isaiah needs rest." Eliza hesitated, then added, "Sarah, you've known me all my life. Do you believe I would deliberately harm Isaiah or anyone else under my care?" Sarah's face remained impressively neutral, but her eyes held a lifetime of carefully contained judgment. "It's not my place to say what the mistress would or wouldn't do. I'm not asking the slave. I'm asking the woman who practically raised me after my mother died," Eliza persisted, a note of desperation creeping into her voice. For a moment, something softened in Sarah's expression. The Eliza I helped raise had a kind heart. But power changes people, Miss Eliza. It changes them in ways they don't always see themselves. With that cryptic response, Sarah excused herself, leaving Eliza alone with her thoughts and the storm raging outside. Later that night, unable to sleep, Eliza wrapped herself in a dressing gown and lit a candle, intending to retrieve her journal and continue her reflections. As she passed the window, a movement in the gardens below caught her attention. Peering through the rain-streaked glass, she made out a solitary figure moving purposefully across the grounds, heading away from the slave quarters toward the woods that bordered Willow Creek. The figure's height and build were unmistakable. It was Marcus. But where was he going at this hour in such weather? A cold realization dawned on Eliza. Marcus was one of the few slaves permitted occasional travel between plantations to deliver messages or goods. He had connections beyond Willow Creek. If he was heading into the woods in the middle of a storm, it could only mean he was meeting someone, perhaps passing word about Isaiah's condition to other plantations, or worse, contacting abolitionists or those who helped orchestrate escapes north. Eliza considered waking Jeremiah, ordering a search party to track Marcus down. But such an action would shatter the fragile peace she had negotiated earlier. Besides, what could Marcus really do? Isaiah's condition was precarious but not yet fatal. By morning, he might show signs of improvement, and the entire situation could still be salvaged. Still, as she returned to bed, Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that events were slipping beyond her control, that forces had been set in motion that would alter Willow Creek forever. In the darkness, punctuated by flashes of lightning and rumbles of thunder, she finally confronted the truth she had been avoiding. The real poison at Willow Creek was not the West Indian remedy in Isaiah's wine, but the institution of slavery itself, corrupting everyone it touched, enslaved and enslavers alike. With that uncomfortable realization settling in her mind, Eliza finally drifted into a troubled sleep, unaware that the crisis at Willow Creek was about to take an even more dramatic turn. The following morning brought an uncomfortable clarity to Willow Creek Plantation. The storm had passed, leaving behind a washed-clean landscape that gleamed under the early summer sun, but the human tensions remained, thick and unresolved. Eliza rose early, having slept poorly. The image of Marcus slipping away into the stormy night had haunted her dreams, along with fevered visions of Isaiah's accusing eyes and Sarah's quiet judgment. As she dressed, she resolved to visit the infirmary first thing, hoping against hope that Isaiah's condition had improved overnight. The plantation infirmary was a small, separate building located behind the main house. Originally built to isolate cases of infectious disease, it now served as the medical facility for all of Willow Creek's inhabitants, though the quality of care varied significantly depending on one's status. The Montgomery family occupied private rooms when ill, while the enslaved were treated in a common ward with 6 simple beds. As Eliza approached, she was surprised to see a small gathering of slaves outside the building, not just the 2 representatives she had authorized, but at least a dozen people, including children. They fell silent at her appearance, faces turning toward her with expressions ranging from open hostility to carefully blank masks. "What's the meaning of this?" she demanded, addressing the group as a whole. "You should be preparing for the day's work." Rebecca stepped forward, her elderly frame straight and dignified despite years of hard labor. Her gray hair was wrapped in a faded cloth, and her dark eyes held the wisdom of decades, witnessing both the best and worst of humanity. "Isaiah passed in the night, Miss Eliza," she said, her voice carrying a weight of sorrow and accusation. "We come to prepare his body according to our ways, if you'll permit it." The words hit Eliza like a physical blow. "Dead? But Dr. Winters said—" "Dr. Winters wasn't here when Isaiah's breathing changed," Rebecca interrupted, a boldness highly unusual for a slave addressing their owner. I watched as the fever took him, as he called out words that made no sense, as his body fought against something working through him like a demon." Eliza felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Isaiah dead. The implications cascaded through her mind. The investigation that would surely follow, the suspicions among the slaves now hardened into certainty, the precarious position she now found herself in. "Of course you may prepare his body," she managed to say, her voice sounding distant to her own ears. "I'll send word to Dr. Winters to return for an examination, to determine the cause." "We know the cause," Marcus cut in, stepping forward to stand beside Rebecca. Unlike the old woman, he made no attempt to maintain even a facade of deference. Isaiah was poisoned for learning to read, for daring to speak of freedom. His death is a message to the rest of us. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathered slaves. Eliza became acutely aware of how outnumbered she was, how far from the main house and any potential assistance. "These are serious accusations," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Ones that could have severe consequences for everyone at Willow Creek. I understand your grief, but I will not tolerate unfounded allegations that threaten the peace and prosperity of this plantation." "Peace?" Marcus scoffed. "There's no peace in chains, Mrs. Montgomery, only the silence of fear. But Isaiah taught us that fear is a choice, one we don't have to make anymore." The implied threat hung in the air between them. Eliza glanced past the group toward the main house, wondering if she could be heard, if she called for help. As though reading her thoughts, Marcus shook his head slightly. "No one will come. Mr. Reynolds rode into town at first light, apparently on your orders. The other overseers are dealing with a fire that broke out in the tobacco-drying barn. Strange timing, wouldn't you say?" Cold fear washed over Eliza. This was no spontaneous gathering, but something organized, planned, and she had walked right into it, alone and unprepared. "What do you want?" she asked, abandoning pretense. "Justice," Marcus answered simply, "for Isaiah, for all of us." "And what does justice look like to you?" Eliza challenged, her mind racing for a way to diffuse the situation, to buy time until help could arrive. Marcus exchanged glances with Rebecca and several others before responding. "We want the truth. About Isaiah. About the wine you shared with him." Eliza's throat constricted. They knew. Perhaps not everything, not with certainty, but enough to trap her in her own deception. "And once you have this truth?" she pressed, stalling. "That depends on the truth itself," Marcus replied, "and on your willingness to make amends." The standoff continued, tension building with each passing second. Then, unexpectedly, Sarah emerged from the infirmary, her expression grim. "Miss Eliza," she acknowledged with a nod that barely qualified as respectful. "Isaiah's body has been washed. You should see what the poison did to him before the men prepare him for burial." It was a command, thinly disguised as a suggestion, and Eliza understood that refusing was not an option. Surrounded by people who had every reason to hate her, she followed Sarah into the infirmary, acutely aware of Marcus close behind her. Isaiah lay on one of the simple beds, his body covered by a clean sheet up to his chest. In death, his face appeared younger, more vulnerable. The lines of defiance and caution that typically marked his expression smoothed away. But the peaceful image was belied by dark stains around his mouth and nostrils, and a peculiar bluish tinge to his skin. "This isn't a natural death," Sarah stated flatly. Rebecca recognized the signs from stories her grandmother told, brought from Africa. A particular type of poison that leaves these marks, that causes a man to sleep before it stops his heart. Eliza stared at Isaiah's body, horror and guilt washing over her in equal measure. She had never intended this outcome. The Frenchwoman had promised the remedy was safe in small doses, a humane alternative to physical punishment. Had she measured incorrectly? Had Isaiah had some unique sensitivity to the compound? "I never meant for him to die," she whispered, the confession escaping before she could consider its consequences. The room fell silent. Sarah and Marcus exchanged a look of grim vindication. "So you admit it," Marcus said, his voice low and dangerous. "You poisoned him." Eliza looked up, suddenly aware of what she had revealed. "It wasn't poison," she insisted desperately. It was meant to be a calming remedy, something to make him more compliant, to avoid the need for whippings and other punishments. I was trying to be more humane, to find a better way to control us. Sarah finished for her, decades of carefully suppressed anger finally breaking through, to make us docile, without marks that might lower our value. Don't pretend it was kindness, Miss Eliza, it was business. The truth of Sarah's words cut deeper than any denial could have. Eliza had indeed rationalized her actions as humane, but beneath that rationalization lay the fundamental truth of slavery, that one human being believed they had the right to control another by whatever means proved most effective. What happens now? Eliza asked, reality crashing in around her. She had admitted to poisoning a slave, even if unintentionally. If word reached the authorities, she could face legal consequences, though in Virginia of 1832, such consequences would likely be minimal for a woman of her standing. More immediately concerning was her position at Willow Creek, surrounded by people who now had confirmation of their worst suspicions. That depends on you, Marcus replied. We have demands. Demands, Eliza repeated incredulously. You're in no position to make demands. When Mr. Reynolds returns, by the time Reynolds returns, evidence of your crime could be spread far beyond Willow Creek. Marcus interrupted. The neighboring plantations, the town council, the church congregation. How would that affect your standing in the community, Mrs. Montgomery, a widow who resorted to poison to control her slaves? The scandal would be devastating. Eliza felt trapped, cornered by the consequences of her own actions. What do you want? Freedom papers, Marcus stated plainly, for 20 of us, to start, including all of Isaiah's family, Rebecca, myself, and Sarah. The request, no, the demand, was so outrageous that Eliza nearly laughed despite the gravity of the situation. Impossible. Even if I wanted to, the laws in Virginia have become more restrictive. Manumission requires special approval from the legislature, and the freed slaves would have to leave the state within a year. We're aware of the laws, Marcus replied calmly. We're also aware that with sufficient motivation and financial incentive, exceptions can be arranged. You have connections in Richmond, Mrs. Montgomery. Your late husband's cousin serves in the state legislature. Use those connections. Eliza stared at him, a new understanding dawning. This wasn't a spontaneous reaction to Isaiah's death, but part of a long-planned strategy. You've been preparing for this, all of you. Isaiah's reading materials, the abolitionist pamphlets, it was all building toward this moment. Sarah nodded, no longer bothering to maintain any pretense of subservience. Isaiah believed education was our path to freedom. He taught those willing to take the risk, organized us, helped us understand that our strength lies in unity. His death won't be in vain. And if I refuse, Eliza asked, though she already suspected the answer. Then Willow Creek burns, Marcus stated simply. The main house, the barns, the cotton and tobacco in the fields, everything you value reduced to ash, and with it, any hope of maintaining your position in society. The threat was delivered without emotion, a straightforward statement of fact rather than a negotiating tactic. Eliza had no doubt they would follow through. These were people with nothing left to lose, whose worst fears about their treatment had been confirmed by Isaiah's death. You're asking me to destroy myself, she said quietly. Even if I secure freedom papers for 20 slaves, the financial loss would be ruinous. And the questions it would raise. You should have considered those consequences before pouring poison into a man's wine, Sarah interjected, her tone cutting. Isaiah is dead because of your actions. 20 lives in exchange for one seems more than fair. Put in those terms, Eliza could hardly argue. Still, the practical realities loomed large. It will take time, she said finally. Arrangements will need to be made, documents prepared. I can't simply write freedom papers today and have them be legally recognized. We understand, Marcus replied. You have 1 month. In the meantime, Work will continue at Willow Creek. We have no desire to destroy the plantation if our demands are met, but there will be changes effective immediately. What kind of changes? No more whippings, no separating families, fair distribution of food and supplies, and 2 hours each evening for those who wish to learn to read and write. The last demand was particularly audacious. Teaching slaves to read was explicitly forbidden by Virginia law. Yet Eliza found herself without leverage to refuse. The knowledge of what she had done to Isaiah hung over her like a sword, ready to fall the moment she defied their demands. Very well, she conceded, feeling as though she were watching someone else make this decision, someone whose life had veered irrevocably off its expected course. But Isaiah's death must be recorded as natural causes. Dr. Winters cannot suspect foul play, or none of this will matter. I'll be arrested before any freedom papers can be arranged. Marcus considered this, then nodded. Rebecca can make it appear that Isaiah died of a brain fever. She knows which herbs to use to mask the signs of poisoning before the doctor returns. But understand this, Mrs. Montgomery. We will be watching your every move. Any attempt to renege on our agreement, any word to the authorities, and Willow Creek becomes a memory. Are we understood? Perfectly, Eliza replied, her voice barely above a whisper. As she left the infirmary, stepping back into the bright June sunshine, Eliza felt as though she were emerging into a world fundamentally altered from the one she had known just days before. The slaves who had gathered outside dispersed as she approached, returning to their duties with a new purpose in their movements, a subtle shift in their posture that spoke of cautious hope rather than resigned submission. Back in the main house, Eliza locked herself in her study, mind racing with the enormity of what had transpired and the challenges that lay ahead. Securing freedom papers for 20 slaves would indeed be difficult, particularly given the increasingly restrictive laws in Virginia. It would require significant bribes, careful manipulation of her political connections, and a plausible story to explain her sudden burst of benevolence. The financial implications were equally daunting. Each freed slave represented not just the loss of their labor, but their market value as property, a substantial portion of Willow Creek's assets. To free 20 at once would dramatically reduce the plantation's worth and its productive capacity. Eliza might maintain ownership of the land, but her status as one of the wealthiest plantation owners in the county would be compromised. Yet as she contemplated these practical concerns, a strange sense of relief began to penetrate her distress. The secret she had carried since Isaiah's collapse, the guilt, the fear of discovery, the self-recrimination, had been unbearably heavy. Now, at least, the truth was acknowledged, the path forward clear, even if it led to her diminishment. A knock at the study door interrupted her thoughts. "Enter!" she called, composing her features into a semblance of control. Jeremiah Reynolds stood in the doorway, his expression troubled. "Mrs. Montgomery, I've just returned from town. There are disturbing rumors circulating, talk of slave unrest at neighboring plantations, whispers of an organized resistance. And now I find that Isaiah has died during my absence, with no overseer present at the infirmary." Eliza maintained a neutral expression. "Isaiah succumbed to his illness, Mr. Reynolds. Rebecca was with him at the end and has prepared his body for burial. Dr. Winters has been summoned to confirm the cause of death." Jeremiah's eyes narrowed slightly. "And the fire in the tobacco barn? Convenient timing, wouldn't you say?" "An unfortunate coincidence," Eliza replied smoothly. "Thankfully, the damage was contained. The men who responded acted quickly." "Men who should have been supervising field work," Jeremiah pointed out. "Mrs. Montgomery, I don't wish to overstep, but I'm concerned about the atmosphere at Willow Creek. The slaves seem different today, less deferential. There's an undercurrent I don't like." "Perhaps they're grieving for Isaiah," Eliza suggested. "He was well respected among them. I've given permission for a proper burial ceremony tomorrow at sundown. I believe allowing them this dignity will help restore order." Jeremiah looked unconvinced. "Dignity is all well and good, but what these people understand is discipline. Isaiah's death should serve as an example of what happens to troublemakers, not be turned into some kind of martyrdom." The casual cruelty of his statement struck Eliza with new force. Had she once shared this perspective, seeing the enslaved people of Willow Creek as little more than children requiring firm guidance, or animals needing to be broken to the yoke? The realization of how much she had changed in just a few days was startling. "Isaiah's death was a tragedy, Mr. Reynolds, not an opportunity for reinforcing discipline," she said firmly. "I expect you to respect my decisions in this matter. The burial will proceed as planned, and I want no interference from you or the other overseers." Jeremiah's jaw tightened at her tone, but he gave a curt nod. "As you wish, but I strongly advise increased vigilance in the coming weeks. Something is brewing, Mrs. Montgomery. I feel it in my bones." After he left, Eliza sat motionless, contemplating the irony of Jeremiah's warning. Something was indeed brewing at Willow Creek, a reckoning long overdue, a shifting of power that had begun with a glass of poisoned wine and would end with freedom papers for 20 souls. And she, the mistress of Willow Creek, had become both catalyst and captive of this transformation, bound by her own guilt to see it through. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the plantation, Eliza unlocked the secret compartment in her fireplace and removed the box of vials. One by one, she emptied them into the flames, watching as the dark liquid hissed and evaporated, leaving behind only a faintly sweet odor that quickly dissipated. The evidence was gone, but the consequences of her actions were only beginning to unfold. In the slave quarters, plans were being made, hopes cautiously nurtured. In town, rumors spread from plantation to plantation, carried by house slaves serving at dinner parties, by field hands meeting at Sunday worship, by children playing together while their mothers washed laundry at the river. And at the center of it all was Willow Creek, where the long summer days now seemed charged with anticipation, a current of possibility running beneath the surface of plantation routine. A change was coming, not the violent upheaval that white Southerners feared, but something more subtle and perhaps more lasting, the first tremors of a foundation beginning to crack. A month passed at Willow Creek with surprising swiftness, each day marked by an uneasy truce between Eliza Montgomery and the enslaved people who now held her future in their hands. On the surface, the plantation continued to function as it always had. Cotton and tobacco grew under the hot Virginia sun, harvesting began in the fields nearest the house, and the rhythm of agricultural life maintained its steady beat. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy, profound changes were taking place. True to their agreement, Marcus and the others had instituted their demands immediately following Isaiah's burial. Each evening after work, a group gathered in the old tobacco curing shed farthest from the main house, where Sarah and 2 others who could read conducted lessons by lamplight. The numbers grew steadily as word spread that the mistress would not punish those who attended. Jeremiah Reynolds and the other overseers noted these gatherings with increasing alarm, bringing their concerns to Eliza repeatedly. She deflected their questions with vague references to a new management approach, suggesting that allowing the slaves some small freedoms in their limited leisure time would improve morale and productivity. The explanation satisfied no one, but with Eliza's authority as owner still technically intact, they could do little but watch and wait. Meanwhile, Eliza worked frantically behind the scenes to fulfill her part of the bargain. Letters flew back and forth to Richmond, carefully worded to avoid raising suspicion. James's cousin, Senator William Montgomery, responded with predictable concern to her initial inquiry about manumission procedures. "My dear Eliza," he wrote, "your sudden interest in freeing slaves raises considerable eyebrows, particularly given the current political climate. The Nat Turner Rebellion remains fresh in many minds, and the legislature has consequently tightened restrictions significantly. I must caution you against any hasty actions that might compromise your standing or the economic viability of Willow Creek." Undeterred, Eliza pressed further, inventing a story about a deathbed promise to her husband regarding certain slaves who had been particularly loyal to the Montgomery family. She hinted at substantial donations to the senator's favorite political causes and reminded him of discreet financial assistance the Montgomery estate had provided during his last campaign. By mid-July, Senator Montgomery's resistance began to waver. "If you are determined on this course," his latest letter conceded, "I can perhaps arrange a private audience with Judge Harrington, who oversees such matters. His interpretation of the law tends to be more flexible when properly motivated. However, I must insist on a limit to the number of manumissions. 20 is far too many to justify without raising serious questions. 10 would be the absolute maximum I could support without risking my own position." The compromise presented Eliza with a terrible dilemma. Marcus had been explicit: freedom for 20 or Willow Creek would burn. Yet here was the best offer she was likely to receive, and the deadline loomed just 10 days away. On a sweltering afternoon in late July, Eliza summoned Sarah to her study, desperate for an intermediary who might help negotiate this impasse. Sarah entered with the quiet efficiency that had characterized her service for decades, though now her demeanor carried a subtle difference. The deference was performed rather than ingrained, a role she played rather than an identity she accepted. "You called for me, Miss Eliza?" "Yes, Sarah. Please close the door." Eliza waited until they had privacy before continuing. "I've received word from Senator Montgomery regarding our arrangement. There's a complication." Sarah's expression remained carefully neutral. "What kind of complication?" "The senator believes he can secure approval for 10 manumissions, but no more. He says 20 would raise too many questions, potentially exposing the unusual circumstances behind my sudden burst of benevolence." "Marcus won't accept that," Sarah stated flatly. "I know," Eliza acknowledged, running a hand through her hair in an uncharacteristic display of frustration. "But it may be the best we can achieve through legal channels. Please, Sarah. You've known me all my life. You know I'm trying to make this right, as much as possible given the circumstances. Help me convince Marcus that 10 now is better than none at all." Sarah studied her former mistress with penetrating eyes. "And the other 10? What happens to them?" Eliza hesitated. "I've been considering alternatives. There are other ways to secure freedom that don't require official manumission papers." "You mean the Underground Railroad?" Sarah said. Not a question, but a statement. Eliza nodded. "I have correspondence from James's time at Harvard, northern connections who might assist. It would be more dangerous, certainly, but potentially effective for those willing to take the risk." Sarah considered this proposal, her face revealing nothing of her thoughts. Finally she asked, "And who would receive the official papers versus this underground option? How would you choose?" It was a question Eliza had been wrestling with herself. "The most vulnerable should receive legal papers," she suggested. "The elderly like Rebecca who couldn't survive a journey north, mothers with young children, those with health concerns. While the strongest, like Marcus, would be sent north with no legal protection, at risk of capture and punishment at every step of the journey." Put that way, the proposal sounded calculating, even manipulative, a way to remove the strongest leaders from Willow Creek while appearing to honor the agreement. Eliza flushed with shame. "That wasn't my intention," she protested weakly. I'm trying to find a solution that works within the constraints we face." Sarah was silent for a long moment, her expression softening almost imperceptibly. "You really don't understand, do you? This isn't just about freedom papers for 20 people. It's about something much larger beginning right here, right now at Willow Creek." "What do you mean?" "Isaiah had a vision," Sarah explained, her voice taking on a reverent quality. "He believed that freedom couldn't come through rebellion alone. There had been too many failed uprisings, too much bloodshed leading nowhere. He saw education as the key, combined with strategic pressure on the system itself. Pressure like blackmailing a plantation mistress who made a terrible mistake. Eliza suggested, a hint of bitterness creeping into her tone. Sarah met her gaze steadily. Yes, exactly like that. Isaiah understood that every institution, even one as entrenched as slavery, has weaknesses that can be exploited. Yours was guilt, Mrs. Montgomery, your awareness deep down that what you were doing was wrong, even before you poured that poison. The accuracy of Sarah's assessment struck Eliza with unexpected force. She had indeed carried a burden of moral discomfort throughout her years as mistress of Willow Creek, suppressing it beneath layers of rationalization and social conformity. Isaiah's death had merely brought that buried guilt to the surface, where it could no longer be ignored. "What would Isaiah have me do now?" Eliza asked quietly. "He would ask you to make a choice," Sarah replied, "not between 10 legal manumissions and 20 partial freedoms, but between continuing to serve a system you know is wrong or helping to dismantle it from within." Dismantle it? Sarah, I'm one woman with one plantation. Even if I freed every slave at Willow Creek, slavery would continue throughout the South. Every journey begins with a single step, Sarah countered. Isaiah believed that change would come plantation by plantation, owner by owner, as the moral bankruptcy of slavery became impossible to ignore. Willow Creek could be the first domino, Mrs. Montgomery, but only if you're brave enough to push it over. The conversation left Eliza profoundly unsettled. That night, unable to sleep, she returned to her private journal, pouring out her conflicted thoughts by candlelight. July 26th. 1832. I stand at a crossroads unlike any I could have imagined a month ago. On one path lies compromise, securing freedom for 10 slaves, while offering the others a dangerous journey north, preserving some semblance of my position in society, maintaining at least partial ownership of Willow Creek. The practical choice, the survivable one. The other path Sarah described is far more radical, so much so that I can barely contemplate it without trembling. To actively work against the very institution that has provided my family's wealth and status for generations. To risk not just financial ruin, but social ostracism, perhaps even legal jeopardy. Yet I cannot unhear the truth in Sarah's words. The guilt that made me vulnerable to blackmail didn't begin with Isaiah's death. It has been there all along, carefully suppressed beneath layers of rationalization and social convention. The poison in the wine was merely the culmination of a moral corruption that began the moment I accepted ownership of other human beings as my birthright. I think of my parents, of James, of all the good slave owners I have known. Those who prided themselves on relative kindness, who avoided excessive cruelty, who clothed and fed their people adequately. We told ourselves these small mercies absolved us of participating in the greater sin. How convenient that our moral arithmetic always produced a sum we could live with. Isaiah saw through this self-deception, and now I cannot unsee what he showed me. The question remains, do I have the courage to act on this understanding, knowing what it will cost? The following day, Eliza requested a meeting with Marcus. They met at the edge of the woods bordering the plantation, away from curious eyes and listening ears. The summer heat had reached its peak, making the air feel thick and difficult to breathe as they stood facing each other in the dappled shade of ancient oak trees. "Sarah told me about your conversation," Marcus began without preamble. 10 freedom papers instead of 20. That's the most Senator Montgomery believes he can secure without raising dangerous questions, Eliza confirmed. Marcus studied her face carefully. And the others? Sarah mentioned something about the Underground Railroad. Yes, though she seemed skeptical of the arrangement. With good reason, Marcus noted. The journey north is perilous, with no guarantees of success. Many die or are captured along the way. It's a poor substitute for legal freedom. Eliza nodded, acknowledging the truth of his assessment. I understand, which is why I want to propose an alternative approach. Marcus raised an eyebrow, inviting her to continue. What if, instead of dividing the group between legal manumission and escape attempts, we used a different strategy entirely? Eliza took a deep breath before continuing. What if I sold Willow Creek? The suggestion clearly caught Marcus by surprise. Sold it? To whom? There are northern investors looking to expand into Virginia agriculture. With my connections, I could find a buyer willing to purchase the land, buildings, and equipment, but not the people. Before the sale, I would transfer legal ownership of all 86 slaves at Willow Creek to a trust, with explicit instructions for phased manumission over 5 years. Marcus's expression shifted from surprise to cautious interest. A trust? How would that work? It's a legal entity that can own property, including slaves, according to specific terms. I would appoint trustees from abolitionist circles in Philadelphia, where I have connections through James's Harvard classmates. The trust would technically own the slaves, but with the sole purpose of emancipating them gradually to avoid raising alarms that might lead to legislative intervention. And you would do this for all 86 of us, not just the 20 we demanded? Marcus asked, skepticism evident in his voice. All of you, Eliza confirmed. It's the only solution that addresses the fundamental wrong here. Freeing 20 while keeping the rest in bondage would merely be another compromise with an immoral system. Marcus was silent for a long moment, processing the proposal. Why? He finally asked. Why go beyond our demands? What do you gain from this? It was a fair question, one Eliza had asked herself repeatedly throughout the sleepless night. Peace, she answered simply. Not just with you and the others at Willow Creek, but with myself. Isaiah's death forced me to confront truths I've been avoiding my entire life. I can't return to willful blindness now that my eyes are open. And what happens to you once Willow Creek is sold and we're all on the path to freedom? I'll retain enough from the sale to live modestly. Perhaps I'll go north myself, where my actions might be viewed as principled rather than treasonous. Eliza gave a small, sad smile. I have few illusions about how Virginia society will react to what I'm proposing. Marcus studied her with an intensity that made Eliza uncomfortable, as though he were trying to peer into her soul to gauge her sincerity. Finally, he nodded slowly. Isaiah would have approved, he said quietly. He always believed that freedom would come not through violence, but through changing hearts and minds, even those we least expected to change. I wish I could tell him I'm sorry, Eliza said, surprising herself with the emotion in her voice. Not just for the wine, but for everything before that, for being part of a system that denied his humanity, that treated him as property rather than a man with dreams and talents and a brilliant mind. He knew, Marcus replied. Even as the poison took him, he understood what was happening and why. His last coherent words were about you, actually. Me? Eliza asked, startled. Marcus nodded. He said, "She'll see the truth now. It will cost her everything, but she'll finally see." The word sent a chill through Eliza, despite the summer heat. Had Isaiah somehow foreseen this outcome even as he lay dying? Had he understood her better than she understood herself? "I'll need time to arrange everything," she said after a moment. "Selling the plantation, establishing the trust, finding the right trustees. It could take months to ensure it's done properly, in a way that can't be easily undone. We can be patient, knowing the end goal," Marcus assured her. "But there will be resistance. Reynolds and the other overseers will fight this. Neighboring plantation owners will see it as a threat to their own interests." "I'm aware of the risks," Eliza acknowledged, "which is why we need to proceed carefully, with absolute secrecy, until the legal arrangements are complete. No one can know what we're planning, not even the others at Willow Creek. The fewer people who know, the less chance of the plan being discovered before it can be implemented." Marcus nodded in agreement. "Just me, Sarah, and Rebecca will know the full truth. For the others, we'll maintain the story that you're arranging freedom papers for 20, as originally demanded. As they finalized the details of their unlikely alliance, the summer sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across Willow Creek Plantation. From a distance, nothing appeared to have changed. The fields still stretched toward the woods. The main house still stood proud on its gentle rise. The rhythms of plantation life continued uninterrupted. Yet something fundamental had shifted, a transformation as profound as it was invisible to casual observation. The mistress of Willow Creek and the slaves she had once owned were now co-conspirators in dismantling the very system that defined their relationship, united by a shared recognition of a moral truth that transcended the social hierarchies of their time. Over the following months, Eliza worked with quiet determination to bring their plan to fruition. Letters to northern contacts were carefully coded, property assessments conducted under the guise of estate planning, and meetings with potential trustees arranged during a supposed visit to family connections in Philadelphia. By December 1832, as Virginia's fields lay dormant under winter skies, the preparations were complete. The trust documents had been drafted by a sympathetic lawyer in Philadelphia, the sale of Willow Creek arranged with a Quaker investor who understood the true purpose behind the transaction, and the gradual emancipation schedule established to minimize resistance from local authorities. On a cold, clear morning just after Christmas, Eliza gathered Marcus, Sarah, and Rebecca in her study to share the news that their plan was ready to be implemented. The documents lay on her desk, pages of legal language that would transform lives and challenge an entrenched institution. "Once I sign these papers," Eliza explained, "there's no turning back. Willow Creek will be sold within the month, and ownership of all 86 of you will transfer to the trust. The first manumissions will begin in February, 20 names drawn by lottery, just as we discussed." "And the overseers?" Sarah asked practically. "Reynolds has been growing increasingly suspicious. They'll be dismissed with the sale," Eliza confirmed. "The new owner has agreed to bring in managers sympathetic to our cause, who will oversee the transition as more of you receive your freedom papers each quarter." Rebecca, who had remained largely silent throughout their planning sessions, finally spoke. "I never thought I'd live to see this day. I was born in chains, expected to die in them too." She reached out with gnarled hands to touch the documents, her fingers tracing the words she couldn't read, but understood would change everything. Isaiah's death brought this about. A terrible price, but perhaps one he would have willingly paid, knowing the outcome. The mention of Isaiah sobered the group. His absence remained a painful reminder of how their journey toward this moment had begun, with a terrible mistake born of the corrupting influence of power and ownership. "Isaiah's death opened my eyes," Eliza acknowledged quietly, "but it was your courage, all of you, that showed me a path forward. This plan doesn't erase my guilt or undo the wrongs of the past. It's merely a first step toward the world Isaiah envisioned, where all people are truly free." Marcus nodded solemnly. "First steps matter. Isaiah used to say that the longest journey seems impossible until someone proves it can be made. Udbriul." With those words hanging in the air between them, Eliza dipped her pen in ink and signed the documents that would forever alter the course of Willow Creek Plantation and the lives of everyone connected to it. Her signature, elegant, educated, privileged, now served not to reinforce the system that had granted her status, but to begin its unraveling, one plantation at a time. Outside, snow began to fall, delicate flakes drifting down to cover the Virginia landscape in pristine white. By spring, when the earth renewed itself and fresh growth emerged from dormant soil, Willow Creek would bear witness to a different kind of renewal. One based not on the cycles of nature, but on the hard-won recognition of a moral truth that could no longer be denied. The mistress, who had once poisoned a slave's wine, would be remembered not for that terrible act, but for what came after. The awakening of conscience, the courage to act on that awakening, and the hope that others might follow where Willow Creek led. It was perhaps the most fitting memorial possible for Isaiah, a man whose death had ultimately brought life and liberty to many, whose final sacrifice had broken the chains of Virginia, one heart and mind at a time.